Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 15th of May 2023. I am joined as ever by my co-host, the fantastic Mr. Andy Brockman, who is looking a little bit less haggard than last week. Are things settling down in House Brockman?
Things are settling down in House Brockman, and thank you very much for the people who commented on our new arrival. We're 2 weeks in, and it's settling into a very pleasant routine. Thank you.
Fantastic. Considering our routines, our ongoing routine is the Watching Brief, and our ongoing Watching Brief continues. And in this week's Watching Brief, we have another one of those canary down the coal mine sort of stories, a little bit like in the past when we've talked about higher education, threats to departments, that kind of thing, or planning policy, other related issues. These are potential problems that if we don't keep an eye on them, don't get ahead of them, could actually get quite bad. And this week, something happened here in the UK that we figured was worthwhile touching on. I mean, we were going to talk about it tangentially up until the point that a certain speaker and speakers got speaking at this thing that we're going to talk about. So it definitely landed in our ballpark, and we figured it was worth bringing to your attention so that we can all be aware and informed. But before we do that, we have a couple of updates for you. First of all, from RAF Scampton. You may recall last week we discussed how it's a site of controversy. The government is planning on using that former RAF base to house asylum seekers while their applications are being processed. And this has come into conflict with the heritage value of the site and the question of how it is best to maintain the connection between a historic World War II squadron base and the current use that the government is proposing. What's happening? What's happened in the past week or so has this issue been resolved?
Far from it, and in fact, it's becoming certainly the archaeological aspects of it is now set up as a direct argument about archaeological value, in fact, and archaeological procedure.
Right.
What has happened since we last spoke about Scampton is that the county archaeologists for Lincolnshire have commented on the RAF heritage unit's application for listed building consent to move the grave memorial and any remains that are on site of Wing Commander Guy Gibson's dog, who's commemorated outside Hangar 2 at RAF Scampton. Now, Hangar 2 is listed, so to move the grave memorial and any archaeological remains of the animal requires listed building consent, and that's currently up on the planning portal of West Lindsey District Council.
Okay.
A statutory consultee is the county archaeologist. Now, the details we talked about last time, so I won't rehash them. Just refer people back to the most recent watching brief. But what has now happened is that the county archaeologist for Lincolnshire has come out against the proposal by RAF Heritage to move the memorial and any remains to RAF Marham, where 617 Squadron is now based.
Okay.
And while the RAF application quotes issues such as, for example, the fact that in their view the future at Scampton is uncertain and the preservation of the monument can't be assured and the safety of the monument can't be assured, and it references the fact that the dog's name, which has actually been removed from the memorial, is probably the worst racial slur in current usage, although it wasn't intended to be that when the dog was named. It's a fact of history that attitudes have changed. So it talks in fairly abstract terms about the need to remove it, and it argues that 617 Squadron is better placed to look after the squadron heritage than leaving the remains and the memorial at Scampton, where the animal lived and was killed outside the station gate, in fact,
Hmm.
on the day of the Dam Busters raid.
Hmm.
Um, the comment by the county archaeologist actually quotes legislation and
Hmm.
guidance and planning guidance. So, in response to the listed building consent application, it quotes, for example, the just going up the hierarchy, really, the local planning policy, which, as the document says, quote, seeks to protect the historic environment of RAF Scampton holistically, by requiring developers to consider the site as a whole through a master plan-led approach to the future of the site.
Hmm.
Um, it also quotes the Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act and the National Planning Policy Framework, and basically says that piecemeal developments such as this proposal, i.e., to move the Labrador's memorial and potentially remains, which remove and erode aspects of character and heritage of RAF Scampton without consideration of the preservation or future use of the site as a whole, could lead to the erosion and eventual loss of RAF Scampton's heritage significance, which is of national and international importance.
Hmm.
In other words, it's a tough statement. It's
Well,
basically saying, don't do this.
yeah. I mean, well, last week I was wondering whether or not the RAF's plan to effectively preserve legacy and presumably preserve the record of the original location. Therefore, I was wondering whether or not that would be considered to be enough in terms of historical value and research value. But presumably, this reading says that's not the case. And I mean, yesterday we were on the phone about this, weren't we? And we realised, or you certainly pointed out, that this is important because the argument could be made, for example, let's go extreme, a castle. You know, there's a castle over there. It's in the way of something that the current local authority or government or someone wants to build going through that land. Well, let's just move it. Let's move it, and we can preserve its heritage and its history by moving it to a new location. But you also destroy its value as a chosen spot for that castle, and also its history in the landscape. So that's a very extreme example, but I suppose is that what's going on here? That people don't want to introduce a sort of a slippery slope notion of heritage by remote preservation, as it were.
I think that is certainly one factor here, and in fact, it's not I would we'll link to it, and I'd urge people to read the statement. It's by Dr. Ian Marshman, ACIFA, who's the Historic Environment Officer for Lincolnshire County Council, who act for West Lindsey District Council in this kind of issue. What Dr. Marshman also says is that the developer's application does not make clear whether it's intended to rebury or retain any zoo archaeological remains at RAF Marham, and whether the integrity of the archive is to be maintained. Now, again, archaeological ethics require that if you dig something out of the ground, you do it under archaeological conditions, you record it, you report it, you conserve it, and you place it in an archaeological archive where it can be maintained sustainably in the future for future research. Right? And he's absolutely right. The RAF plan doesn't say that. And in fact, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and they made the point, which is implied in the statement, is what happens if 617 Squadron is subsequently moved from RAF Marham, or even disbanded, which has happened in the past.
Yeah.
It was disbanded and then reconstituted. So this is this appears to be an effort by the RAF to solve a short-term political and PR issue, as they see it. But in fact, it's riding not exactly roughshod, but it's been achieved by sidestepping the issues of archaeological ethics. And I'll just read you the last paragraph of Dr. Marshman's comment to the council.
Mm-hmm.
It says, quote, local planning authorities should require developers to record and advance understanding of the significance of any heritage asset to be lost, wholly or in part, in a manner proportionate to their importance and the impact, and to make this evidence and any archive generated publicly accessible.
Mm.
However, and this is in bold, however, the ability to record evidence of our past should not be a factor in deciding whether such loss should be permitted. And that's a quote from the National Planning Policy Framework, Section 16, paragraph 205. In other words, the fact that the RAF can move this thing and record it archaeologically
Mm-hmm.
Is not an issue in the planning decision.
No.
The planning decision has to look deeper than that.
Mm.
Just because you can do it, it doesn't mean you should do it or should be allowed to do it.
No. Well, it's intriguing, isn't it? Because this element of the well, actually, it reminds me, oddly enough, of Netflix, like so, or pick your streaming service, because I love DVDs. I love Blu-rays as well. But I used to work in Blockbuster. I have a huge DVD collection, and for a long time, and also especially in the realm of computer games, I prefer to have a physical copy of something as opposed to relying on it being available on a streaming service forever, because you never know what's going to happen to that company in the future. I've become a bit more relaxed with that in recent years, especially with certain releases that are likely to be available on multiple platforms. But anyway, the point being, you can't rely it's going to be there in the future, and therefore attaching a sense of ownership, or a sense of, in this case, for example, preservation by record to what could be in the future a disbanded unit in the RAF or squadron. Is a risky strategy potentially, and it may well feel as though, especially to the guys and gals in the squadron, that that they are taking ownership of their history, of their group's history and their story. But that's the deeper issue, isn't it? The deeper issue is, well, what happens when you're not here? What happens when all of you are retired, and then at some point a future prime minister says we don't need an air force anymore, or whatever happens, there has to be a deeper consideration of ownership. And it's a knotty one, because also I can see though why it's so compelling, and also why presumably the RAF thought it was actually a really good solution, because individual units do hold dear the stories of their forebears, don't they? And maybe also for them, they don't necessarily want to see this pivotal moment that's represented by this memorial just becoming part of another government site, an anonymous place where the government houses people or goods or whatever in the future. So I can see why it's compelling, but also, as you say, there's a very serious question in terms of what actually is the value of that from a archival and physical historical record perspective.
I think it's also fair to say that if you look at the public comments on the West Lindsey planning portal, people are not happy at all about this. Now, you can argue about whether the issue of the grave of the dog and the listed buildings are being used to leverage, for example, anti-asylum seeker feeling or NIMBY feeling.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly there are many comments on the planning portal opposing this specific move. It's just, it's not about the asylum seekers camp. It's about moving the memorial to Gibson's dog. And pretty much unanimously, the comments were along the lines of, this is an integral part of the history of RAF Scampton and history of our community as people who've grown up alongside RAF Scampton or even been involved with it or worked on it or whatever. And it would absolutely devalue it to move it anywhere else.
It's one of my favourite phrases from my dissertation supervisor. One of my favourite quotes of his is place is space objectified," and that's exactly what this is. If you take away the object of that place, or one of the objects of that place, it simply becomes a space and loses its identity.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. You know, the hangars are listed because they're pre-war and they're an important survival which Historic England has decided are worthy of listing. And it's been signed off by the Secretary of State for Culture. But they're, if you like, generic pre-war hangars of a certain type. It's the fact that they've survived so well is why they're listed, and obviously the historical association with Scampton. But that particular monument, the one that the RAF now wants to move, is absolutely tied to, and it's one of the few things that are on that base that are absolutely tied to Operation Chastise and on 16-17 May 1943.
Yeah.
And that's why you know it has absolutely become objectified. It's emblematic of that moment, which is culturally important through the 1954 film, and it points up a lot of issues, and it's being used actually as the you know the point issue in the whole debate about Scampton as an asylum seekers camp, if you like. But
also,
regardless of that, if it was for anything else, the same archaeological issues would apply.
Well, exactly. Yeah. In that sense, there are broader questions here about what constitutes a historic site. Yeah. Okay. News story number 2. This isn't the same bunch of metal detectorists. This is a different other metal detectorists who are just in it for the love of history. Obviously, have pled guilty for having been caught detecting on a site where they shouldn't be. 4 men have appeared in court in East Anglia, Suffolk, I think, over illegal metal detecting at a protected Roman site called Balaam, I believe. Is it just a season for catching these stories? Do you think the press are just noticing them at the moment, or actually is there something happening in terms of vigilance and metal detecting where you shouldn't be metal detecting?
Right, we're talking about a place called Balaam. It's a Roman fortified settlement in mid Suffolk, and we're talking about a court case that took place earlier this week. What is going on, I think, is, first of all, there is an increased awareness of heritage crime and the crime of illegal metal detecting. That is in fact, almost entirely due to the way that Historic England and particularly with their police and heritage crime advisor Marc Harrison, and cards on the table. I know Marc. I was actually at school with him many years ago now, more years ago than we probably both like to remember. But actually, we sort of lost touch and didn't sort of touch base again until he popped up doing the job with Historic England, at the time seconded from Kent Police.
But is he Marc with a C or not?
He's an MARK, Marc.
See, I'm fine. It's fine. I'm still the best C in your life. Okay, go on.
But no, I mean, about 10 years ago, I got a phone call from Marc saying, "Do you remember?" and listed a whole list of teachers from the school that we both attended. Like, okay, yeah, right, okay. So one of those bizarre coincidences that happen in people's lives. But as I say, what Marc and his colleagues at Historic England have been doing for over 10 years now is pushing heritage crime up the agenda as something that is both important culturally and socially, but also in terms of adding value to heritage practice. In that, you know, it is a way communities can come together to work with police and law enforcement to um, deal with not just things like metal detecting, but also antisocial behaviour, like, for example, spray painting the wall of a church or something, or vandalising a graveyard or
Yeah.
something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So heritage crime takes all sorts of forms, right up to the top end when you're trafficking, trafficking artifacts. And again, another issue that's been rising up the agenda.
Well, and also as a related issue would be a couple of years ago, I was on a site where it was moorland, lots of gorse bushes, that kind of thing, and
mm,
low, small man-made lakes from former mining activity. And what people found was that young men were buying cheap cars from scrap dealers, metal merchants, taking them onto the land and burning them, but they were burning them after they'd sort of totaled them, and they were putting at threat a Bronze Age landscape in that sense as well. So
yeah.
sometimes it's not even directly, people won't necessarily even be aware that they're on a heritage or historical site, and they can be committing crime against it in that sense, or putting it in
Oh,
danger.
absolutely. Among other cases that they've dealt with, for example, have been people off-roading on prehistoric earthworks,
Yeah, yeah.
and that kind of thing. So there's a whole range of issues that fall within the remit of heritage crime, or the
Mm,
definition of heritage crime.
mm,
Um, and but it is rising up the agenda. Historic England have been, I think, very deliberately prosecuting cases in particular areas to establish case law.
mm.
Um, Metal detecting being one, issues around the Treasure Act. We saw the case in Durham just a couple of weeks ago, which we commented
Yeah.
on Watching Brief. Um, and the other issues around, and this one in particular is to do with unlawful metal detecting on a scheduled ancient monument.
Mm, mm.
Balaam is a Roman fort and settlement site. Now, when I started looking at this, in fact, there is history of illegal metal detecting on that site going back more than a decade.
Right.
Um, and so the current case is just the latest, really.
Mm,
It's a well-known site. In 2011, there was a case where police were called in the early hours of the morning to what appeared to have been a fight between people metal detecting unlawfully on the scheduled area.
right.
Um, and then in 2012, um, after police set up a watch on the site as a result of the previous case in 2011,
Mm-hmm.
um, then more metal detectorists were caught and prosecuted. Two, in fact. And so the latest case that was at Suffolk Magistrates Court this week is really only the latest. Four men have pleaded guilty to charges related to illegal metal detecting. One has also pleaded guilty to possession of archaeological material that have been removed unlawfully. Sentencing will take place on the 28th of June, and we'll watch out what happens and what kind of sentences are handed down.
I always feel duty bound at this point to ask, what can the metal detecting community do about this? Because again, we don't want to tar everyone with the same brush. But we have seen, and I'm seeing, for example, on TikTok, a huge growth in people doing live events where they're just looking down metal detecting as they go through a random field and chatting away with people, sometimes 10, 20, 50,000 people at a time who are watching. There's been a huge growth of interest in metal detecting. And with that, I suppose charitably, we might say maybe a huge growth of people who don't fully understand necessarily the rules. Is there something that the metal detecting community can do to help avoid these sorts of problems?
I think the metal detecting, or certainly many members of the metal detecting community, would already say that they go out of their way to try and explain to people joining the hobby what the rules are, what the law is, which is what
Mm,
most importantly,
mm,
and that you hear it said also, why is it always mentioned that these people are metal detectorists? They're thieves. Well,
Mm.
yeah, they are, but actually they're both, because they're using metal detecting equipment
Mm.
um, to go out and steal stuff.
It's not only a case of, I suppose, explaining the rules to newcomers, though, is it? The other day I saw in a local second-hand store, Cash Converters, a metal detector being sold in its original box, and the box said it was a treasure hunting machine, treasure
Yeah,
hunter.
yeah,
So it's a little bit like with e-bikes, electric scooters, where actually there are often very strict local rules on where and when you can ride them. Shops
mm,
selling them have no obligation to include directions or suggestions as to how they're used, and people can get hold of this and start the hobby in terms of metal detecting very easily.
yeah. That's right. And in fact, just to explain to people, and particularly people maybe outside the UK who aren't aware of quite how lax the regime
Mm.
is in this country, um, in my view, rightly, you have to buy a license to watch television, because that then pays for the free to access BBC channels across the board, from local radio right up to national television, and covering things like the coronation, which we saw just 2 weeks ago.
Mm.
And when you buy a television, your address is taken, and if you haven't got a TV license registered to that address already, you'll get reminded.
Mm.
Um, Metal detectors, which arguably can be used for good, but also for to damage the environment and for illegal activities, no such thing.
Mm. Mm.
Um, you know, Fishing licensed,
Hunting.
environmental,
Yeah.
on environmental grounds largely,
Mm.
not metal detectors. Um,
Drone
and
flying.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I mean, you can't even. Yes, exactly. You're supposed to. You take your online qualification, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that gives you access to at least the foothills of drone operation,
Mm. Mm.
with other more moronious regimes, for the more complex and the machine that you want, and the larger the machine that you want to fly.
Mm.
So it's there does seem to be an anomaly here, and however well self-regulated metal detecting is or claims to be, it's clearly not working well enough.
Mm.
And okay, you can argue that there will always be a certain number of individuals who will use any activity to for personal gain unlawfully.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that doesn't mean you don't have to try and stop them, and you certainly don't. Um, you don't say, oh, we're off limits because we're nice people.
Mm. Yes, exactly. Yeah, because we're nice people. And in this instance, yeah, you could argue that a license wouldn't halt people going to a Roman site like that and digging
Mm.
illegally. But at the very least, as we've discussed previously, it would very quickly establish that these people are acting counter to a license that they agreed to. And if they're
Yes.
unlicensed, then that's an immediate, prosecution.
Yeah.
Um,
Now, it can
Go
be
ahead.
it can be said that one of the things, if you've got a license, then you can have your license removed, you can have your equipment removed. Now, at the moment, courts are removing people's metal detectors.
Right.
They're taking their kit away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's seized by the police. They don't get it back
Mm.
as part of the court judgment.
Mm.
Um, but there aren't licenses, so that you can't. It's more difficult to check, for example, on somebody's bona fides.
Mm.
It's argued that it will be a cumbersome process, an expensive process, and it's not necessary, because self-regulating the hobby is largely working. Personally, I think that's becoming increasingly untenable as a point of view. I think on environmental grounds and on grounds of being able to control criminality, I think we're moving closer to licensing.
Mm. Mm. Well, there we go. Those are our two things to keep an eye on, and developments related to, particularly in last week's watching brief. We'll see you after this message from us. A watching brief is a formal program of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you. So now we move on to the main portion of this week's watching brief. It's the canary down the coal mine, as I was saying before, and it's all to do with a certain conference that was held earlier this week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 15th, 16th and 17th of May, that seems to have broken new ground in some respects. It's I'd never heard of this conference before.
I don't know if it's broken new ground. I mean, it was discussing issues that were certainly very current in the 1920s and 1930s.
No. But this type of conference, I'd never heard of it before, and with good reason. It seems that this was the first that this organisation was attempting, and we're talking about the National Conservatism Conference. This thing, it on the face of it, I have to say, initially I thought it's just going to be a niche little thing, people talking about, within a very controlled and small echo chamber with very little influence. But then I started to see recent cabinet ministers, current cabinet ministers, and other influential people attending and agreeing with people, other people speaking at this conference. And then, of course, David Starkey turns up as well. And initially, I have to say, folks at home, because I do try and keep us on some sort of editorial straight line here on Watching Brief. Initially, I was saying to Andy, really, we're going to talk about the National Conservatism Conference, aren't we? Archaeology and history news based for the most part. But actually, it very quickly became clear that this conference and these sorts of conversations very quickly use ideas of history and presentations of historical thought and progression to justify current stances on live political, personal, and economic subjects. So here we are, and I mean, what do you make of it? It seems like, first of all, are we importing American republicanism? Is that it? Are we going to have to put up with that stuff soon?
I think the short answer is almost certainly yes, and that's why I wanted us to talk about this. The National Conservatives.
So go on.
This is really serious.
It is. I'm crying, man. I'm not laughing. So go on.
Okay, taking a deep breath and taking this extremely seriously, because it is extremely serious.
It is. Yes, it is.
Yeah. Conference took place in London earlier this week, 15th to the 17th of May. And if you look at the website now, some of the comms have actually been, I think, unintentionally hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that's because it's an American operation being transferred to the UK, and there's just and people in charge of the comms are Americans and don't quite get the nuances and the ironies of some of what they're putting out. Mm-hmm. There are some suggestions, I think, that maybe they made some miscalls.
Okay.
Possibly because they're not familiar with the culture in the UK.
Mm.
But for a start, the abbreviation on their About page is NatCon. Now, given that the standard abbreviation for understanding of con in the UK is of a con trick, that's slightly unfortunate.
Yep.
But taking it at face value, what they say is the National Conservatism Conference brings together public figures, journalists, scholars, and students who understand that the past and future of conservatism are inextricably tied to the idea of the nation, to the principle of national independence, and to the revival of unique national traditions that alone have the power to bind people together and bring about their flourishing. We're talking about a kind of nationalism. And in fact, one of the American speakers, talked about faith and flag. Faith, flag.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Go
Yeah.
on.
Well, no,
Um,
I was just going to say, I hadn't heard that exact phrasing that you just read out. That's, I mean, I don't want to reach for the F word, but that's right there, isn't it? It's right there. Like
a
the,
number of commentators have been calling the whole operation F word adjacent.
yeah, yeah. That's wow.
I
Okay.
mean, yeah, I mean, it goes on. It says we see national conservatism as the best path forward to a democratic world confronted by a rising China abroad and a powerful new Marxism at home. We see the rich tradition of national conservative thought as an intellectually serious alternative to the excesses of purist libertarianism and the stark opposition to political theories grounded in race. So, that's pretty clear.
Yeah. Go on. Yeah.
Now, one might argue that there is an underlying element of race in all this, and it's people whose skins are, say, the colour that our skins are, rather than our friends and colleagues who have different colour skins.
Well, yeah, yeah. That's that. It's interesting that they set up opposition to others and then say we can't talk about there being others.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mm.
Yeah. And again, we talked about Dr. Starkey. We'll come back to Dr. Starkey, but he certainly referenced the Black Lives Matter movement
Uh huh. Yeah.
in his speech to the conference. And then it says uh, they try again as an American operation. They're trying to tie this particular conference very particularly to the United Kingdom. They say the United Kingdom is forging its own independent path outside the European Union. National conservatism offers a guide which honours British history, seizes the opportunities of the moment, and fits us for the future. And then it talks about the it being a project of the Edmund Burke Foundation, a public affairs institute founded in January 2019, with the aim of strengthening the principles of national conservatism in Western and other democratic countries.
Right.
Um, Now, you know, everyone's entitled to freedom of speech,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but the argument is that freedom of speech also brings with it um, a requirement for speaking with responsibility,
Mm.
and there is an argument that the evidence of the conference suggests that some of the speakers, at least, who were attending, were irresponsible at worst, at the very least, unfortunate in the way they phrased some of their arguments.
Mm.
Now it went from the ridiculous and the almost funny. So, for example, Jacob Rees-Mogg, recently the minister, cabinet office minister, and an ardent Brexiteer, appearing to admit on stage that the government's bill requiring people to voting
Voter ID.
in the
Yeah.
UK to carry voter ID was actually, quote, gerrymandering.
Well, actually, it was voter suppression, but let's not split hairs.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, exactly.
he doesn't
Exactly.
even know what he's doing. Sorry, go on. Sorry.
But and there, Michael Gove, for example, took part in what was described as a fireside chat, where actually he appeared to say that this was a sort of cul-de-sac which, if the Conservative Party disappeared down it might not be to its advantage. At the same time, it gave rise to some very good jokes along the lines of if he's having a fireside chat, are they burning books or crosses?
Yeah. So,
Um,
you think he turned up a current? This is a current minister. He turned
yes.
up to try and be a voice of reason, as it
I
were.
think you can argue that, yeah,
Right.
and certainly compared to some of the other comments that were made during speeches,
Yeah.
you know, um, it, it was almost like a sort of fan convention for the Daily Mail. If you look at the other people, some of the other people
Mm-hmm.
who were speaking, um, David Frost, former head of the whiskey manufacturers organisation, later the person who supposedly negotiated the oven-ready EU trade deal,
Yeah.
who's since spent his time basically reneging on it and saying
Disowning
how
it.
what a dreadful deal it is.
Mm.
Um, Columnist at the Telegraph and now would-be Conservative MP, apparently. Danny Kruger, right-wing MP, actually son of Prue Leith from Great British Bake Off, although a lot of people think his ideas are pretty half-baked.
Hey, do they have a soggy
See what I did
bottom?
there? Um, uh, Nigel Bigger, the theologian, who is an eminent supporter of the view that the British Empire wasn't really that bad, and we didn't really oppress anybody. And if bad things happen, well, that happens in empires. And it's certainly nothing to do with today. And in fact, the Heritage Panel was chaired by Zuditu Gabriel-Hannes, the chair of the non-political Restore Trust group that's been trying to infiltrate the ruling bodies of the National Trust to roll back wokeness. I think would be one way that they would put it. So those are the people who were putting forward various views. Miriam Cates MP, Conservative MP, again on the right of the party, made a speech where, and again, this is where people started to get worried, because she was talking about the birth rate being one of the greatest problems that Britain faces. Now, I think with the best will in the world, with inflation running at plus 10%, with jobs being threatened left, right, and centre, in the latest, but thousands of jobs being threatened by AI at BT, British Telecom, and British car manufacturers saying they might or car manufacturers in Britain saying they might be forced to pull out and relocate to the EU because of origin rules under the EU deal, the Frost's EU deal. The birth rate isn't necessarily right at the top of the agenda.
Well, the thing is, I've heard about the birth rate. I've heard the birth rate being discussed in other fora, and they tend to be more concerned about what the babies look like.
Well, that's the code.
Yeah,
that is absolutely the code. Yeah.
Yeah, go on.
No, go on. No, all I was going to say, all of that really was rolling the pitch for the main event. And the main event were two speeches, one by Douglas Murray, the right of centre commentator, and another by Dr. David Starkey, everybody's favourite Tudor historian.
Well, it should also be said, just for people who don't know, Douglas Murray is associate editor of The Spectator and host of the History Uncancelled podcast, I believe.
Yeah, and that's why we're talking about the NatCons, or the Nazis, as they were rather crudely caricatured as.
Yeah.
On social media. That's why we're talking about it. It's because we heard in the manifesto on their manifesto page that history, country is absolutely central to this initiative.
Yeah.
And Murray and Starkey both made comments which really showed the dangers of taking that point of view, I think. I'll do Starkey first, because it was such a slam dunk that it can be dealt with quite quickly, I think. In a keynote speech in the heritage section of the conference, and I'm quoting here from the National Conservatism Conference's own yellow-ticked Twitter feed. They quoted Starkey under hashtag NatConUK. The reason that the left has such ire for the Jews is jealousy. They want to replace the Holocaust with slavery in order to wield its legacy as a weapon against Western culture. Now, that manages to be both racist and anti-Semitic in a couple of dozen words. And that was very quickly taken down by the National Conservatism Conference themselves, although Twitter being Twitter, it had already been screenshotted.
And just to be clear, that was the conference feed quoting him from Starkey. His keynote speech. Yeah,
absolutely,
right, okay.
Absolutely. Now, remember, the last time Dr. Starkey was in the news was on GB News when, sorry, beg your pardon, it wasn't on GB News. It was in an interview with Darren Grimes, who was also speaking at the conference. And they got to talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, and Starkey made the comment that slavery wasn't a genocide because too many of the damn blacks survived, words to that effect.
Yeah.
So he's got form for this.
Yeah.
And the conference must have known what they were going to get when they booked him.
Yeah.
And what they got, of course, was people like us talking about it. And while most of the people who are watching this will be absolutely appalled by words like that, if he meant it, it is absolutely. But apart from anything else, it's historically untenable.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I keep on catching glimpses of my face when I'm not actually thinking about what I'm looking, what the face I'm making, and I start just to look disgusted and horrified. So it catches me off guard. But I think that's largely because some of these quotes I hadn't heard until this morning. Until just now.
Exactly. Well, and the thing is, the point is that for everybody. For 10 people, for 100 people who were appalled by what Starkey said when it went viral on social media, there'll be one or two who think, the calculation will be there will be one or two who'll think, good on you, mate, and thank you for saying that on my behalf, and because we're being cancelled. That's the underlying theme of a lot of the speeches there. It was people saying the unsayable because right of centre beliefs are cancelled by the woke media and the woke academics and the woke historians and so on.
Well, it's the strange simultaneous problem of being a populist or a nationalist in that sense, is that you both have to believe in your innate superiority, but also believe that at the moment you're a victim of someone else's gains.
Exactly. The belief that your beliefs, your ideas, your ability to communicate is being cancelled, which you are communicating to the public via the means of national radio and television stations and national newspapers.
Well, and crucially, I mean, we've highlighted some of the MPs that went, but also the Home Secretary was there.
The Home Secretary was there indeed.
Suella Braverman spoke at the thing. And in that sense, she, while not directly responsible for Department for Culture, Media and Sport, or I think digital's been separated now again, hasn't it, or something?
Yeah, it has, yeah.
But anyway, not being directly responsible for, she certainly outranks culture in that sense. And often, the Home Secretary gets to sign off on stuff like, for example, blowing up of towers in the north of England because they deem it to be culturally valuable or not, or lacking in value. This isn't even just it's reaching into the heart of government. This particular conference, and it's saying some really foul things. I mean, what is actually the risk of this influencing policy? I mean, was there anything else that came out of the history part of the conference?
Well, I think the other historical element, and actually, I did Michael Gove a disservice just now because I said he was the voice of reason, but in fact, there was one comment he made which were absolutely now the sort of victimhood that was evident in the whole conference. I think it was actually, you look at it, it was incredibly defensive for something that was meant to be promoting a positive program. It was really defensive. It was about circling the wagons and saying how beleaguered we all are, but let's all stick together and for flag, faith, and freedom. And but one of the things that Gove said was, and you could argue this was turning gaslighting up to 11. He said that if you're on the progressive left, you deliberately seek to polarize the world into woke and the unwoke. Conservatives don't do that. Now,
oh, come on.
Yeah.
And he didn't explode. Like there was no fire. His pants didn't go on fire. Like
No, no. His wife fronts didn't spontaneously combust, and he didn't even start pogoing on the dance floor.
Come on, Gove. That's
If you don't believe me, the clip is on the ITN News Politics Twitter feed.
right.
But look, the way journalists were treated is another issue around that conference. But I'll maybe come back to that later if we get time. But no, look, I mean, I think we need to drag it back to the history, because that is why I wanted to talk about this today. And we'll go back to Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray, as you say, associated with the Spectator magazine. He writes for the Sunday Times, another right of centre newspaper. He gave the keynote speech at the conference's gala dinner. Now that took place in the main hall of the Natural History Museum in London. If anyone who knows it, is this amazing sort of mock, sort of Byzantine almost
Brick-built structure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's famous for once having housed the cast of Dippy the Diplodocus. Dippy the Diplodocus is now
just because that's a bone cast construction. It's not that's not a Broadway musical.
Yes. No, Dippy's now gone on tour and has been replaced by the skeleton of a blue whale as a symbol of natural history and the environment and the importance of the environment that we live within and can directly influence, and that the museum purports to try and teach us about. So the dinner took place in that great hall, which the museum lets out for commercial hires, which this was, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But Douglas Murray, in his keynote speech, said that, and again, this is from the National Conservatism blue-ticked Twitter feed. This is not being put out there by, any, a woke historian or the terrible left-wing Guardian newspaper. This is from their own Twitter feed. Murray said, quote, "There was nothing wrong with nationalism in Britain. It's just there was something wrong with nationalism in Germany. I don't see why no one should be allowed to love their country because the Germans mucked up twice in a century." I'll let that sink in for a moment.
I see. So, especially in the Second World War, that happened because people loved their country too much.
Yeah.
Right.
And it was mucked up by their leaders.
It did, yeah.
The Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jewish people and other ethnic minorities, gay people, and so on,
Gypsies,
Roma, and Jehovah's Witnesses, etc., was mucking up nationalism and spoiling it for everybody else.
But also, as well, you see, there's something really important here. Nationalism, in that context, especially in a British context, often relies on the old, I used to hear people shout, 2 world wars, 1 World Cup, that kind of thing. So it exists in opposition to German nationalism. So is he, I understand what he thinks he's saying, but there's not even a rhetorical value in what he's saying, because why would it matter what another nation did in terms of its nationalism for your nationalism to be okay or not okay? So what he's actually doing is he's directly connecting cultural conservatism to what happened in the 20th century in Germany, at least once, if not one, and twice, depending on how you view the happenings around the beginning of the First World War. But my point being, though, is that it's slightly breaking my brain, because it makes no sense. But also, as well, more to the point, on the surface level, what he's getting at, just saying that it was just a mess up, it was just a hiccup, it was just a otherwise perfectly valid expression of love for your country. It's pretty gross. What does it
Yeah,
mean? What does it mean if the Natural History Museum is hosting this? Because the Natural History Museum, as you say, they have an environmental awareness concern at the moment, trying to push for life that's
yeah,
alive now as opposed to dinosaurs, for example.
yeah,
Human evolution is very much celebrated in that building.
absolutely.
What does it mean for them to host this?
Right, this is where it gets interesting, because uh, all our museums operate commercial policies to try and subsidize their operations.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, the moment Murray's comment went became public, it went viral and it was attacked across the spectrum,
Hmm.
um, uh, from Jewish groups to academics, archaeologists, even. And it, put it this way, it was largely seen as an offensive mistake
Okay.
at best. Now, in response, the following day, the Natural History Museum put out a statement, including on again on its Twitter feed. And I'm quoting directly here. The Natural History Museum champions diversity, equality, and inclusion of all peoples. We hire rooms in our building to hosts for a range of events, but are clear that this is not an endorsement of their products, services, or views. Now, that's a sort of don't blame us, we only provided the four walls.
Mm.
I think it's fair to say that a lot of people thought they should have done their homework before accepting the booking in terms of reputation management. And certainly the PCS Culture Group, which is a group representing many of the museum's staff and particularly the public-facing staff, um, they put out a tweet in response to the Natural History Museum's comment saying, quote, "We're happy to hire out our rooms to anti-Semites for money, might not be the slam dunk defense you think it is."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And
yeah,
just one thing I just want to say as well is that I don't think we need to explain our discomfort and disgust with all this stuff. So I'm not going to. But but I imagine that there'll be people, as you say, that 1 in 10 who just think, oh well, these are people in this box complaining about us because they don't like us. If you don't understand, then that in this instance that's not my problem, my fault. But I suppose the question is what can we do together as a sector? What can our colleagues do? What can our friends do to be alive to this as a movement in our society in a post-Brexit Britain, where this conference has just happened and seemingly they're probably going to try again next year, I guess. What can and should we be doing?
I think that there's a saying: the price of freedom is eternal vigilance,
Hmm.
and that's real freedom for everybody, not freedom for David Starkey to be a racist.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, um, it's freedom for people to be um, free from fear
Hmm.
of being attacked by racists
Hmm.
who may or may not be inspired by the kind of language and the kind of othering that we saw on display, arguably in at least parts of that conference and elsewhere in the media, including, as one of her colleagues, Baroness Vasi, has said of the Home Secretary, the language that she's using is othering and dangerous
Hmm.
when she's talking about you know migration, legal and illegal. You
And
know,
well, and
so
given that explicit appeal to history, though, looking
mm,
backwards to forge your way forwards, this kind of thing,
yeah,
it's a little bit difficult because in that sense we know that especially being an island, Britain does have some
mm.
distinctive historical characteristics and cultural
For good
developments
and
over
bad,
time.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not like you know it's about contextualizing our heritage and our history, isn't it? It's
Mm.
about uh, I actually read an interesting quote this morning where someone said that they distrust anyone who just says how amazing our ancestors were because they're clearly ignoring stuff, and maybe
Yeah,
that's a way of tackling this is to say well, actually history isn't there to forge a bright future. It's there to be proud of and to learn from and to hopefully grow out of. That kind of approach.
Yeah. Look. I mean, I think there is a direction of travel in public discourse around these issues in this country, which I think any of us who work in heritage, in archaeology, and particularly in communicating heritage and archaeology, need to be aware of and need to be prepared to argue about and, if necessary, face down in public. And that is the increasing use of historical tropes to justify right-wing policies. And look, just to, I think I'll leave it there for now, but I'll make one final observation, which is a couple of years ago, the right-wing Conservative MP for Shrewsbury, Daniel Kaczynski, was disciplined by the Conservative Party for attending a previous National Conservatism conference that was held outside the UK. He attended. This time, 2 cabinet ministers were in attendance, and the Conservative Party said not a word. In fact, the attendance has been defended by various people as part of the natural discourse of politics.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I think that's worthwhile noting. Definitely. Absolutely. I guess that's been a watching brief. Those of you who are eagle-eyed or eagle-eared will notice that we didn't talk about the thing, whatever the thing was that I was so excited to talk about last week, because this took precedent. But we will be talking about the thing, I do believe, next week, won't we, Andy?
I hope so. And I'll also mention a couple of other things for people to keep an eye on, stories to keep an eye on. One is the Punch Bowl Inn, which people might remember was unlawfully demolished by a developer in Lancashire. The developer has now submitted a planning application for holiday lets on the site, saying that it's not possible to rebuild the listed building as they've been instructed to. So that's one to watch, because that's a trial of strength between a developer and the local authority and Historic England.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully they just get a letter back saying no.
Look, council officers are really overworked, so I think they can restrict the reply really just to 2 words, one of which begins with F and one of which begins with O.
I see. I won't think too much on that, but yeah, I see. No, that's going to be one to keep an eye on, definitely.
Certainly, yeah. No, there's a really important heritage listing principle at stake in how that whole event transpires.
Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah. Another story to keep an eye on. It's our old friend Mayor Ben Houchen of Teesside. Since we last spoke about the works, the controversial work at the Teesside Freeport, the story has been picked up by a number of national news outlets, including Sky News. Houchen was interviewed on BBC's Newsnight the other night, and all because there is now likely to be a significant inquiry, probably by the National Audit Office, into the whole Teesworks project and the financing of it. And of course, that includes the demolition of a Dorman Long Tower, which we broke the story about in terms of how Mayor Houchen, we think, gamed the listing system again, gamed the system to bring the tower down when having previously committed to preserving it, and the involvement of senior members of the government at the time, including Nadine Dynamite Dorries, who I understand is about to be elevated to the House of Lords.
Okay. And I suppose one final thing just to mention is that this week we've been recording, as ever, using Zoom. And they've just introduced a delightful new feature where after every 40 minutes, because we were using the free version of Zoom, not only do you have to restart your call, but now they've introduced a 5 minutes, I think 9 minute, as you put it, enforced break between calls. So it's been an interesting Interesting prospect keeping our conversation going with these 9-minute breaks this week, hasn't it? You don't
It's been
see.
a test. It's been a test of short-term memory.
Yeah, yeah. What did you say? What was I saying?
Yeah,
I can't.
yeah.
Absolutely. So, yeah, we might have to find a new video platform to record this on, which is always fun for me because it means I have to reformat the screen and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, a bit frustrating there, definitely.
Can I make one last very quick point actually before we go? And it is actually comms related. We're talking about the difficulties we've got of using we've just discovered this morning using a very familiar and widely used comms platform. There was an interesting Twitter discussion that was going on among my Twitter friends earlier on in the week about communicating archaeology and different platforms and so on. We are planning to do a watching brief special about archaeology comms. And particularly in the light of the development of things like AI generated texts. And really, I think we'd just like to ask everybody out there, what are your feelings about archaeology comms? Good, bad, what's effective, what's not? What does archaeology need to be doing in future? Really to find outlets and get noticed. When standard archaeology podcasts, vodcasts get a few hundred, couple of thousand views, and metal detecting channels get 50,000 plus.
Yeah.
What do we need to do to make our voice heard as archaeologists in that public space?
Good question. Well, guys, that's something to think about. Do comment below. Do let us know if there's anything else you wanted us to talk about in future watching briefs, any breaking news stories or things you wanted to keep an eye on. We do have open DMs and private ways of being contacted, but also as well, you'll see the email address on the screen just below. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.